Amsterdam, 1991, a city of lights, canals, and whispers. Behind the postcard beauty, another world moved quietly, a network of money, power, and ambition. At the center of that world stood one man, Klaas Bruinsma. To some, he was a businessman. To others, a philosopher in a tailored suit. To all, he was a mystery, the figure they called de domine, the pastor. He wasn't a preacher in the pulpit, but he believed in a code of discipline, loyalty, and precision. And that belief built an empire that few ever saw coming. To understand Klaas Bruinsma, we have to go back to post-war Amsterdam, 1953. The Netherlands was rebuilding, proud and practical, a nation of hard workers and careful planners. In this setting, Klaas was born. Curious, observant, always asking why. He grew up in a household that valued order and tradition. But even as a child, he saw that not everyone played by the same rules. He noticed the small cracks in the system, places where confidence and quick thinking could take a person far. By his teens, Amsterdam had changed. The youth movement was in full swing, the city's streets filled with art, music, and rebellion. Klaas moved through it quietly, learning how people made money, where it went, and how networks really worked. He had no interest in chaos, only in control. While most young men chased adventure, Klaas chased understanding. He realized that structure, not strength, was power, and that lesson would shape everything to come. The 1970s opened new doors. Global trade was expanding. Borders were shifting. Information and goods flowed more freely than ever before. In that environment, Klaas found his calling: organization. He began building a network of trusted contacts: businessmen, sailors, transporters, people who could move things across Europe efficiently and discreetly. Where others saw risk, he saw logistics. Where others saw rules, he saw routes. Klaas treated every venture like a company, with meetings, records, and systems. He demanded reliability, clarity, and precision from his associates. To them, he wasn't just a leader, he was a mentor. He called his approach structured freedom. Each person could act independently, as long as the whole remained stable. And under that structure, success grew. He created partnerships across borders, expanded markets, and set new standards for discretion. For nearly a decade, everything he touched seemed to work. The newspapers didn't write about him, and that was exactly how he liked it. By the early 1980s, Amsterdam had become Europe's playground, a magnet for entrepreneurs and risk-takers. And somewhere among them moved Klaas Bruinsma, quiet, composed, calculating. He was expanding into legitimate businesses, hotels, leisure venues, gaming companies. It wasn't just about profit anymore. It was about legacy. But success brings scrutiny. Regulators and journalists began to ask questions. Where did the money come from? How did one man rise so quickly? Klaas answered with charm and silence. He understood the art of presence, to say little, reveal nothing, and always seem in control. Authorities watched from afar, trying to connect dots that never quite formed a picture. His operations were layered, complex, always one step beyond reach. It was less a wall and more a fog. You could see its shape, but never its center. By the late 1980s, Klaas Bruinsma had become an enigma. Some called him a visionary, others a cautionary tale. He surrounded himself with professionals, former security officers, accountants, and legal minds. He wanted order, efficiency, and respectability. He wanted to build something that would last beyond him. But power, even silent power, carries weight. Friends became cautious. Partners grew restless. Klaas felt the pressure of a life lived under observation. And in that pressure, he turned inward, to philosophy, to solitude, to reflection on the choices that had brought him here. He often spoke of balance, that every rise comes with an equal descent. Those close to him said he became almost prophetic, speaking less of business and more of fate. And then, one evening in the early 1990s, his chapter quietly closed. No headlines, no spectacle, just an ending. And the mystery of what it all truly meant. But the structures he built, the systems, the methods, the way he thought, didn't disappear. They lived on, influencing new generations of entrepreneurs, investigators, and policymakers who studied the balance between ambition and consequence. Every story leaves an echo. Sometimes it's a whisper that fades. Other times, it's a vibration that lingers, reshaping everything it touches. When Klaas Bruinsma's era ended, Amsterdam didn't just breathe a sigh of relief. It held its breath. Because no one knew what would happen to the vast, invisible structure he had built. The connections, the money, the delicate balance between the seen and the unseen. His organization didn't just vanish. It was too complex, too deeply woven into the city's fabric. This wasn't a simple story of power lost. It was the beginning of a profound transformation. In the weeks that followed, Amsterdam felt strangely quiet. Those who had relied on Bruinsma's network found themselves adrift. They had resources, but they had lost their direction. He had been the conductor of an orchestra that few even knew existed. Without him, the rhythm faltered. Meetings once planned with precision became uncertain. Deals slowed, then stalled. For the first time in years, silence filled rooms that had always hummed with careful coordination. But nature and business abhor a vacuum. The spaces he left behind began to attract new forces: entrepreneurs, financiers, and risk-takers who saw opportunity where others saw danger. Some wanted to preserve the stability he created. Others wanted to reinvent it completely. Meanwhile, the authorities moved in, cautiously. They opened old files, traced shell companies, and tried to map the lines of ownership that Bruinsma had so brilliantly designed to be invisible. What they uncovered astonished them: a network of legitimate enterprises that blurred the line between lawful and unlawful profit. It was a masterclass in modern finance, and a serious wake-up call for regulators across Europe. For years, people had spoken of him as a legend. Now, analysts and policymakers began studying him as a case study. They even gave it a name: the Bruinsma effect. How one man's organizational genius had outpaced the very systems meant to control it. Throughout the early 1990s, a new generation of Dutch investigators took on the daunting task of understanding Bruinsma's world. They weren't just chasing ghosts, they were chasing methods. How did he build such fierce loyalty without being seen? How did he maintain absolute control without overt force? How did he hold a vast network together when most members didn't even know who was at the top? Investigators soon discovered his greatest strength had been communication. Not loud speeches, but quiet consistency. Calm directives, clear expectations, and an uncanny ability to listen. People followed him because he offered certainty in an uncertain world. In government reports and university lectures, Bruinsma became an unlikely subject of study. His management style, once confined to the shadows, was dissected by economists and sociologists. They found patterns that looked eerily familiar to corporate boardrooms: a balance of hierarchy with autonomy and loyalty with incentives. It was uncomfortable to admit, but the truth was clear. Many of his strategies weren't inherently criminal in their design. They were organizational masterpieces, simply misapplied. He had taken the logic of multinational corporations and applied it to an invisible economy. The question facing the Netherlands was profound. Could that same logic be used for good? Could the transparency, structure, and efficiency he had hidden in the shadows be repurposed to strengthen legitimate commerce? Out of that question came sweeping reforms. Banking oversight tightened, corporate registration laws were modernized, and in an unexpected twist, Dutch law enforcement began collaborating with economists and data scientists, blending human intuition with mathematical precision. Bruinsma's legacy was evolving. He was no longer just a myth, but a model. By the late 1990s, Amsterdam had entered a new era. Art, film, and literature began revisiting the city's transformation, not to glorify, but to understand. Documentaries, novels, and plays tried to capture the duality of the man they called de domine, the preacher. Some portrayed him as a cautionary figure, a brilliant mind undone by ambition. Others saw him as a symbol of the Netherlands' entrepreneurial spirit, flawed, yet visionary. The public's fascination grew because his story wasn't just about crime, it was about control. How far can structure go before it becomes obsession? Where is the line between discipline and domination? Every city needs its myths. For Amsterdam, Klaas Bruinsma became one, a mirror held up to its own contradictions. A city that prided itself on openness and freedom had also produced one of Europe's most enigmatic power brokers. Sociologists found that his story reshaped how young entrepreneurs thought about risk. It wasn't about following his path, but about studying the limits of ambition. Business schools even used his case to teach ethics and accountability, showing how vision without transparency can collapse under its own weight. Through this re-examination, Amsterdam reclaimed its narrative. It turned a story of secrecy into one of learning. The same city once overshadowed by whispered names now celebrated open discussion. Museums curated exhibitions about the transformation of trade, showing how legal and illegal economies had once intertwined, and how they were finally separated again. This wasn't rewriting history. It was reconciling with the past. As the new millennium began, the Netherlands found itself at the forefront of global technology and finance. Globalization had changed everything. What once moved by ship now moved by signal, data, currency, ideas. And yet, the lessons from the Bruinsma years remained relevant. Governments realized that modern power no longer looked like cash or territory. It looked like information. They built new systems of transparency, digital ledgers, international cooperation agreements, and sophisticated data analysis. Many of the analysts who designed these frameworks had studied the very files once used to track Bruinsma's operations. They were determined never to be outpaced again. But beyond policy and paperwork, there was a more human lesson, the understanding that ambition, left unanchored, can reshape an entire culture. The story of Klaas Bruinsma became a parable about boundaries, how innovation needs ethics, and how progress demands reflection. Today, when you walk along the canals of Amsterdam, you might pass the places once connected to his network: cafes, warehouses, offices. They look ordinary now, part of the city's daily rhythm. But beneath that ordinary surface lies a quiet reminder. Structure is power, and true power must be transparent. His former associates moved on, many into legitimate ventures in technology and real estate. The network, once secretive, evolved into a web of lawful enterprise. Some even say Bruinsma's insistence on discipline laid the groundwork for a generation of Dutch business leaders who prized efficiency and discretion. He had sought control. What he left behind was a new kind of order. More than 3 decades later, Klaas Bruinsma remains a figure of intense debate. Not for what he did, but for what his life revealed about systems, people, and the thin line between creation and collapse. He showed that intelligence without transparency becomes isolation, that success without accountability becomes a burden, and that every network, no matter how brilliantly designed, depends on trust that can't be manufactured. In academic circles, he's a paradox, a man who could organize chaos, yet struggled to control his own solitude. In cultural memory, he's a ghost, not haunting, but instructive. A voice reminding Amsterdam that innovation must always carry a conscience. If you listen closely on a quiet evening by the canal, you might imagine the faint sound of typewriters, conversations, and plans being drawn. They're only echoes now, the memory of a time when ambition outran oversight. But the city has learned, and in that learning lies the truest legacy of all. Klaas Bruinsma wanted order. In a way, he got it. Not in the form he intended, but in the lessons that outlived him. The very systems he inadvertently inspired now protect the society that once feared his influence. And that is the final irony of De Dominee. History doesn't just leave us with memories, it leaves us with systems. And when those systems are challenged, great cities don't just erase the past, they learn from it. In the early 1990s, the Netherlands faced a turning point. The secretive networks that had flourished for years were finally brought into the light. It was time to rebuild, thoughtfully, deliberately, and for all to see. The first step was simply acknowledging the truth. For decades, Amsterdam had balanced on a thin line between freedom and regulation. It was a city of art and openness, but one where business often outpaced the rules. Now, a simple question echoed through the halls of power, in newsrooms, and among citizens. How do you encourage innovation without losing control? Committees were formed. Reports were written. For the first time, economists sat down with detectives, and lawyers collaborated with sociologists. They weren't hunting for individuals anymore. They were mapping the systems. They studied how networks operated in the shadows, how money moved invisibly, and how silence had taken the place of trust. Out of this deep dive came an idea that would shape the next decade, using transparency as a tool for prevention. Banks implemented new reporting standards. Corporations were required to publicly declare their ownership structures. Trade routes and customs inspections were modernized with digital databases. It wasn't exciting, headline-grabbing work, but these quiet, steady reforms were laying the foundation for a safer, more accountable Europe. For the people of Amsterdam, this was a period of rediscovery. The city's reputation, once shadowed by secrecy, started to brighten, now associated with innovation, design, and sustainable business. What was once hidden was now discussed openly, even in academic circles. This reconstruction wasn't about punishment. It was about achieving clarity. And in a world of shadows, clarity became the new source of power. By the mid-1990s, technology had emerged as the new language of order. Files once buried in dusty cabinets were now digitized. The Ministry of Finance partnered with universities to map economic behavior, not to point fingers, but to anticipate future trends. For the first time, the Netherlands started using data not just to look back at the past, but to forecast the future. This fusion of governance and innovation led to Europe's first experiments in financial analytics. On glowing green screens, patterns that were once invisible came into focus: money flows, unusual spikes in trade, and sudden, unexplained gaps in the system. It was no longer about suspicion. It was about understanding complexity. Interestingly, the very principles that had once guided underground networks, decentralization, autonomy, and trust, were now being rewritten into law. Small companies were encouraged to regulate themselves. Audits became a cooperative process, not a punitive one. Transparency, once a source of fear, became fashionable. Amsterdam transformed into a living laboratory for modern governance, pragmatic, creative, and always looking forward. The city learned a valuable lesson. Control isn't about restriction. It's about visibility. It's about creating an open system where everyone can see how the pieces fit together. It was the same kind of efficient structure that had been admired in the shadows, but this time, it was brought into the light for everyone to see. While the government was busy building new systems, the people of Amsterdam were rebuilding trust. Universities launched new programs focused on ethics and entrepreneurship. Students learned not just how to turn a profit, but how to measure the consequences of their actions. A new concept started appearing in lecture halls: moral logistics. It was about designing systems that were both efficient and fair. Professors used old case studies not to celebrate the past, but to analyze it, asking a critical question: what happens when intelligence outpaces integrity? That question became a moral compass for a new generation of Dutch entrepreneurs. This spirit of reflection also blossomed in the arts. Filmmakers re-examined the 1980s, framing it as a story of temptation and transformation. Writers delved into the psychology of ambition. Painters filled galleries with images of bridges, both literal and symbolic, connecting the city's past with its present. Through creativity, Amsterdam translated its hard-won lessons into its culture. The city that once kept secrets was now a city of stories, and those stories built a stronger, more resilient community. It wasn't about forgetting what happened. It was about integration, weaving caution into courage. This reconstruction wasn't built from bricks and steel. It was built from understanding. By the early 2000s, the Netherlands had become a global model. Nations across Europe looked to Amsterdam's reforms as a blueprint for their own transparency laws. What some started calling the Dutch framework inspired international agreements on finance and ethical trade. Ironically, the same principles of decentralization and communication that once allowed illegal networks to thrive were now powering legitimate international cooperation. It was as if Europe had turned a new page, using the architecture of the past to build a safer present. Amsterdam's skyline began to change. Old, forgotten warehouses were transformed into bustling innovation hubs. Offices once shrouded in silence became vibrant co-working spaces, buzzing with design startups and sustainable energy firms. And while his name was rarely spoken, the influence of figures from the past lingered. not in their actions, but in the new, transparent systems built to replace them. They had shown the world the high cost of operating in the dark. Now, the city was demonstrating the power of living in the light. 30 years after that era ended, Amsterdam feels different, safer, wiser. Yet, it still possesses that same restless energy, that constant drive to innovate, to question, to push the boundaries. Because that is what true reconstruction means, not just rebuilding what was lost, but reinventing what can be made better. Today, in government buildings, digital dashboards track transactions in real time. In classrooms, students learn that ambition without transparency is a dead end. And in quiet cafes, older generations share stories, not of fear, but of lessons learned. The Netherlands didn't just recover, it evolved. It built a system where ethics are a part of the infrastructure, and collaboration is valued over competition. This evolution wasn't the work of one person, it was the collective act of a society that chose openness over secrecy. And perhaps that is the truest reconstruction of all. It's not about rewriting history, but re-engineering trust. Every great city has two stories, the one it shares with the world, and the one it learns from within. Amsterdam's inner story is no longer about hidden networks. It's a story of accountability, resilience, and the firm belief that transparency is the ultimate safeguard of freedom. Reconstruction is never truly finished. Each new generation must rebuild its own systems of trust. But thanks to the lessons of the past, they no longer have to start in the dark. The echoes of that bygone era still drift through the canals, not as a warning, but as a reminder that order without openness will always collapse, and that true strength is built in the sunlight. Legacies aren't carved in stone. They're rewritten every day in the choices people make about what to remember, what to forgive, and what to learn. The story of Klaas Bruinsma isn't just about one man or one era. It's about how a society can transform its own reflection, turning complexity into clarity and caution into wisdom. For years, his name was whispered as a symbol of secrecy and ambition. Today, it lives quietly in archives and studies, woven into the background of how Europe understands integrity, business, and the balance of freedom. This isn't a tale of downfall. It's a tale of transformation, of how a city reimagined its very soul. Amsterdam, once wary of its own past, learned to live in dialogue with it. You can feel it in the rhythm of the streets, this coexistence of memory and motion. City planners rebuilt with intention, glass facades where there were once closed walls, open markets where there had been secrecy. The architecture itself began to speak of transparency. The buildings stand like mirrors, reflecting the sky and the constant movement of the city. Every pane of glass is a quiet declaration. Nothing to hide, everything to see. In the heart of the city, old warehouses became learning spaces. Here, business students study not just profits, but principles. They explore the lessons hidden between the lines of history. That innovation without accountability always comes at a cost. The people of Amsterdam understand something profound. The past isn't a weight. It's a compass. Each generation reads its direction differently, but they all move toward the same horizon: openness. What began as a period of reflection has turned into a culture of mindfulness. From policymakers to artists, everyone learned that trust, once broken, can only be rebuilt through honesty and transparency. Not force, not silence, but light. This transformation didn't stop at the Netherlands' borders. Across Europe, a quiet revolution took place, one driven not by politics, but by philosophy. Governments began collaborating in ways that once seemed impossible. Databases merged, regulations were synchronized, and new institutions were born from a shared belief that cooperation is the only antidote to secrecy. It was as though Europe had found a new heartbeat. Each pulse carried information, not rumor; coordination, not chaos. Academics dubbed it the age of visible systems. Networks that once thrived unseen were replaced by partnerships that thrived in daylight. And in the margins of those academic papers, the ghost of Klaas Bruinsma's legacy flickered. A lesson learned, never forgotten. This was the quiet paradox of history. From the cracks of disorder, Europe built its most transparent age. And in that transparency, it rediscovered trust. Trust became the new currency. more valuable than gold, more stable than markets. Without it, nothing lasts. With it, everything can begin again. But beyond laws and reforms, beyond politics and systems, the story became something more intimate. A meditation on human ambition. Teachers told the story not to glorify or condemn, but to explore the delicate balance between intelligence and integrity. They reminded students that leadership is not about control, but about guidance, not about dominance, but responsibility. People began to see in his journey a mirror of their own struggles, the temptation to move faster than the rules, the challenge of staying grounded when success accelerates. In cafes and boardrooms, the conversation changed. It was no longer about how much one could gain, but how long one could stand proud in the light of scrutiny. To this new generation, Bruinsma's story wasn't a warning, but a reminder that true success is not about control over others, but about harmony within oneself. He became a case study in the cost of imbalance, and in that cost, the next generation found direction. Amsterdam today is a city built on paradox. Old yet new, small yet global, open yet intimate. It thrives because it accepts its contradictions instead of hiding them. In many ways, this acceptance is the true reimagining of Bruinsma's legacy, a city that took the concept of order and rewrote it with empathy. Here, in the bustling markets, diversity isn't a slogan, it's a rhythm. Merchants from every culture share space and trade stories. Innovation hums in converted lofts where startups build the future. The city still values discipline and efficiency, but it tempers them with creativity and kindness. The lessons of structure survived. The spirit of transparency made them humane. This, perhaps, is the paradoxical triumph of the story. The very qualities that once built walls now build bridges. The same precision that once guarded secrets now protects openness. The Netherlands became a leader in sustainability and ethical trade. Its people learned that the same focus once used for control could instead fuel stewardship. For the planet, for each other, for the truth. What remains of a man after his era ends? Not his buildings, not his money, not even his name. What remains is influence, the invisible imprint on how others choose to build. Klaas Bruinsma's influence endures not as a shadow, but as a shape, the outline of a lesson etched into a nation's conscience. He taught a hard truth. That genius, unbalanced by ethics, turns inward and collapses. That power without transparency suffocates itself. And that every system, no matter how clever, is only as strong as the honesty of its builders. The city didn't erase his memory, it reinterpreted it. It turned caution into education, mystery into understanding, and isolation into community. In this reimagined legacy, Bruinsma is not the villain of Amsterdam's story. He is the question it continues to ask itself. How do we create progress that never needs to hide? Every reform, every policy, every open door in this city is, in a way, an answer to that question. The systems that were once invisible are now designed to stay in the light, not to control people, but to protect them. And that is the final chapter of transformation. Not punishment, but renewal. History remembers names, but wisdom remembers patterns. The rise and fall of one man became the rise and evolution of a nation. Amsterdam's story is no longer about secrecy. It's about courage. The courage to face the mirror, to accept imperfection, and to grow. When the city sleeps, the water still moves, endlessly circling back, carrying reflections of bridges and lights. Each ripple is a reminder that change never truly ends, it only deepens. And if you listen closely, beyond the hum of bicycles and the sound of the wind, you might hear something faint. Not a whisper of fear, but a whisper of learning. Because in the end, every story of darkness is also a story of illumination. And every legacy, no matter how complicated, can be reimagined as a lesson, if we have the courage to listen. The Netherlands rose again, not by denying what was, but by redefining what could be.
The case may be closed, but criminology never sleeps. Like and subscribe join Criminology, and step deeper into the dark with us.